He was born into a life that many could only dream of. A big house with tall gates, cars lined up in the driveway, and every toy a child could imagine. But inside that world of wealth, the young boy carried a heavy burden. His father was one of the richest men in the city, and with that came endless expectations. The boy was told from the start that he had to be the best, not just good. He had to win every exam, every award, every challenge. But no matter how hard he tried, things never worked out that way. Every time the teacher handed him back his test paper, the marks were low. Sometimes he even failed completely. At first, he thought maybe he just needed to study harder, but the harder he studied, the more confused he became. The words in the textbooks felt like a foreign language. The numbers danced around the page until his head hurt. When he went home, things were no better. His father would look at the red marks on the test paper and sigh deeply. "Do you know how many sacrifices I make for you?" he would say. "All I want is for you to do well. Is that too much to ask?" The boy wanted to explain, but he didn't know how. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't careless. He just couldn't seem to make sense of the lessons, no matter how many hours he spent. The teachers in school began to whisper. Some of them said he wasn't trying. Others believed he was spoiled by his father's wealth. A few simply gave up on him, assuming he wasn't smart enough. And the students, his classmates, laughed the loudest. They mocked him not for being poor, but for being rich and still failing. "What's the use of all your father's money?" one of them sneered, "if you can't even pass a simple test?" At lunch, he often sat alone. He could hear the whispers and the jokes. Sometimes, his friends pretended to invite him to study with them, but it was only to watch him struggle and laugh when he got the answers wrong. He carried the weight of shame everywhere he went. The worst part was the pressure he felt inside his own home. His mother tried to defend him, saying maybe he just learns differently. Not everyone is the same. But his father wouldn't listen. "Excuses," he said firmly. "If he can't pass simple exams now, how will he ever run this family business in the future?" Each word felt like a stone thrown at his heart. At night, lying in his huge bedroom filled with toys and gadgets, he stared at the ceiling and wondered why life felt so empty. Why did it seem that no matter what he did, he always failed? He had everything on the outside, but inside he was breaking apart. One evening, after another failed exam, he stayed late at school. The classroom was empty, and he sat staring at the paper full of red marks. His hands trembled as he thought about what his father would say when he got home. He didn't even notice when the school halls grew quiet. That's when he heard the sound of a broom brushing against the floor. Looking up, he saw the school janitor, a man in simple clothes, his back slightly bent from years of work, sweeping slowly down the corridor. The boy lowered his head quickly, embarrassed. He didn't want anyone to see him like this, defeated and broken. But the janitor noticed. He stopped sweeping and asked gently, "Why are you still here, son?" The boy didn't answer at first. He just shrugged and tried to hide the test paper. But the janitor smiled softly and said, "You don't have to tell me. I can see it in your eyes. You're carrying something heavy." For a moment, the boy felt a strange comfort in those words. It wasn't pity, it wasn't judgment. It was just understanding. And that was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The boy didn't know it yet, but that simple moment, sitting alone in a silent classroom, with a poor janitor noticing his pain, was about to change everything. The boy left the school late that evening with the janitor's gentle words echoing in his mind. "You're carrying something heavy." No one had ever said something like that to him. Most people only spoke about his failures, his wasted potential, or the shame he brought to his father. But this man, someone who barely knew him, had seen right through the walls he tried to hide behind. Still, when he walked through the tall, iron gates of his home, the feeling disappeared. The house was grand, with lights shining brightly across the wide lawn, but inside those walls he felt smaller than ever. His father was waiting in the study, as usual, sitting behind a desk stacked with papers. When the boy handed over the test sheet, his father's face tightened. "Again," his father said, his voice sharp. "How many times will I have to see this?" The boy lowered his head. His hands gripped the paper tightly, as if it might crumble in his palms. He wanted to explain, but what could he say? That he studied, but forgot everything the moment the test began? That he read the same line 10 times, but it still made no sense? His father wouldn't understand. Enough, his father continued. From tomorrow, I'll hire another tutor. If you can't manage with one, I'll bring in two. If you still fail, I'll bring in more. I don't care what it takes, but you will stop embarrassing me. The boy nodded silently. He didn't argue. He couldn't. But inside, he felt the weight pressing down even harder. More tutors, more hours, more pressure. None of it ever worked, yet his father believed that money could fix everything. The next day, another tutor arrived at the mansion. This one was strict and spoke in a cold, clipped tone. She pushed him to memorize page after page. If he got an answer wrong, she scolded him. You're not focused, she snapped. You're not trying hard enough. But he was trying. Every night he stayed up late, eyes burning as he bent over the desk. His notebook filled with lines of messy writing. Yet when the exams came, his mind still went blank. He watched the other students in class finish quickly, their pens racing across the page, while he sat frozen, staring at questions he didn't understand. The laughter soon followed. Did you fail again? A boy sneered during recess. What's the use of being rich if you can't even spell your own name? Another chimed in. Maybe your father should just buy the school. Then you can get good grades without trying. The boy clenched his fists, but he said nothing. He wanted to shout back, to defend himself, but he was too tired, too broken. So he sat in silence while their laughter echoed in his ears. At lunch, he often chose the corner table, away from everyone else. He poked at his food, appetite gone. He could see groups of students chatting, laughing, trading snacks. He used to dream of being part of those groups, of having someone who cared enough to sit with him. But dreams didn't matter anymore. One afternoon, as he sat in class, the teacher asked him a question. He froze. His mind was empty. He could hear his classmates snickering behind him. Don't bother, someone whispered. He doesn't know the answer anyway. The teacher sighed and moved on, not even waiting for his reply. The boy sank lower in his seat, wishing he could disappear. By the time the final bell rang, he felt drained. His books weighed heavier than ever, though they carried nothing but words he couldn't hold on to. Walking out of school, he saw his father's driver waiting by the car. The ride home was silent, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, thick with unspoken disappointment. At night, alone in his room, the boy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his father's angry face, his classmates' mocking laughter, the endless cycle of failure. He wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe he wasn't good enough. Maybe he really was useless. He remembered something the janitor had said that night at school. You're carrying something heavy. It was the first time someone had seen the pain he hid so carefully. That thought gave him a tiny spark of comfort, but it wasn't enough to erase the fear he felt every day. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's life became a routine of pressure and loneliness. Tutors came and went. His father's lectures never stopped. The red marks on his test papers piled up. And with each failure, his confidence shrank until he almost believed he had no future at all. But deep down, a small part of him longed for someone to believe in him. Not a tutor paid by his father, not a teacher with a classroom full of students, not even his parents. Just someone who could look past the grades, past the mistakes, and see the person he was inside. What he didn't know was that the same janitor he had met once before would soon step into his life again. And this time, the conversation would last longer than a passing remark. This time, the man who swept floors and fixed broken desks would offer something no amount of money could buy, a way to see learning in a completely new light. The boy's days continued much the same, filled with tutors, pressure, and disappointment. But one late afternoon, after another long and tiring class, he found himself once again sitting alone in the empty classroom. His latest test paper lay on the desk in front of him, covered in red marks. He had studied for hours the night before, but the results were the same. He buried his face in his arms, too tired to even cry. That's when he heard the soft scrape of the broom against the floor. He looked up and saw the janitor again, quietly sweeping the corridor. The man paused at the door and gave him a small smile. "Still here?" he asked gently. The boy nodded but said nothing. He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to hear more scolding or pity. But the janitor didn't push. Instead, he stepped into the room and leaned on the broom handle. "You know," he said, "this place gets real quiet after everyone leaves. Sometimes it's the best time to think." The boy stared at him, unsure what to say. No teacher had ever spoken to him that way. No tutor had ever cared if he was tired or lonely. This man didn't sound like someone who was here to judge him. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint sound of the broom bristles against the floor. Then the janitor looked at the paper on the desk. "Tough day?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "I failed again." The janitor nodded, not with surprise, not with judgment, just with quiet understanding. "Failure," he said, "isn't the end. Sometimes it's just the first step to learning something new." The boy frowned. He had heard plenty of people talk about failure, but it was always in the form of lectures, empty words that meant nothing. But coming from this man, the words felt different, honest, real. "Do you know how many times I failed before I learned how to fix things?" the janitor continued. "Broken lights, leaking pipes, old locks. Nothing worked the first time I tried. But I kept going. That's the only secret. You just keep going." The boy looked at him with curiosity. No one had ever explained failure that way before. To his father, failure was shame. To his teachers, it was proof that he wasn't good enough. But to this janitor, it was simply a step on the way forward. That evening, for the first time, the boy didn't feel completely alone. The next day, when his last class ended, he didn't rush to leave. He stayed back again, quietly packing his books, almost waiting. And just like before, the janitor appeared, sweeping down the hall. "Back again?" the man asked with a chuckle. The boy gave a small smile. "I guess so." This time, the janitor set the broom aside and pulled up a chair. "Tell me," he said, "what part of school feels the hardest for you?" The boy thought about it. "All of it," he admitted. "The words don't make sense. The numbers, they just disappear from my head. Everyone else understands, but I just can't." The janitor leaned back. "Maybe the problem isn't you," he said. "Maybe it's the way you've been taught. Have you ever tried learning in a different way?" The boy tilted his head, confused. "A different way?" "Yeah," the janitor said. "Not everyone learns by staring at books. Some people learn by doing, by seeing, by connecting things to real life." The boy listened carefully, intrigued. No one had ever suggested that before. Tutors only drilled him harder. Teachers only told him to pay more attention. His father only demanded results. But this man was saying maybe he wasn't broken. Maybe he just needed to learn differently. That evening, the janitor gave him a simple task. "Here," he said, pointing to a broken chair in the corner. "Let's fix this together. I'll show you how, step by step. Pay attention and ask questions if you need to." The boy followed carefully as the janitor explained how to tighten the screws, how to check which parts were loose, and how to balance the legs so the chair stood steady again. It wasn't easy, but it made sense in a way books never did. For the first time in a long while, the boy felt a spark of excitement. When the chair finally stood firm, the boy couldn't stop smiling. "I did it," he whispered. "You did," the janitor said with a grin. "See? You're not hopeless. You just needed the right way to learn." From that day on, the boy stayed after class more often. The janitor became not just someone who cleaned the halls, but a quiet teacher, a mentor. They talked about schoolwork, about life, about how learning wasn't about being perfect, but about being curious. The boy began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He still struggled in class. He still faced laughter from classmates and pressure from his father. But inside, something was changing. He had found someone who believed in him, someone who didn't measure his worth by grades or wealth. And that small change was the beginning of something far greater. The weeks rolled on, and each day after school the boy found himself lingering in the classroom, waiting for the quiet moment when the janitor would appear. It was no longer by accident. He wanted to be there. For the first time in his life, he had found someone who didn't see him as a failure, but as a person who simply needed a different path. One evening, As the last of the students left, the boy sat hunched over his math book. Numbers filled the page, but his mind was already shutting down. The janitor walked by, noticed the boy's heavy sigh, and gently asked, "Still fighting with those numbers?" The boy nodded. "No matter how many times I try, they don't stay in my head. I feel stupid." The janitor shook his head. "You're not stupid. You just haven't found your way in yet. Let me show you something." He pulled a scrap of paper from the trash, smoothed it out, and drew a quick sketch of a grocery cart. "Imagine you're at the store. You buy 3 apples, each one costs $2. How much will you spend?" The boy blinked, then said slowly, $6. "Exactly," the janitor smiled. "That's multiplication. 3 times 2. You just used math without opening your book." The boy stared at the drawing. For the first time, the numbers didn't feel like enemies. They felt like something real, something he could touch. The janitor continued, "Math isn't about memorizing symbols. It's about life. Every time you buy something, every time you fix something, every time you share something, it's math." The boy felt a spark inside. It was so different from how his tutors had explained things. With them, numbers were abstract, floating in space, meaningless. With the janitor, numbers became apples, chairs, coins, and tools. Suddenly, they had meaning. The next day, the janitor showed him a leaking tap in the washroom. Together, they unscrewed the worn washer and replaced it with a new one. As they worked, the janitor explained the science behind water pressure, how the smallest part could cause a big leak. "This is science," he said. "Not just in books, but here in your hands." The boy listened carefully, his eyes following each step. He didn't understand everything right away, but he felt something he hadn't felt before: curiosity. Over time, the janitor introduced him to new lessons, always hidden inside ordinary things. History became stories told while they walked past old framed photographs in the school hallway. "Every picture," the janitor said, "is a moment in history. Don't memorize the dates. Remember the people and what they lived through." The boy nodded, realizing he remembered the stories far better than lists of events from his textbook. Slowly, the boy began to see the world differently. The janitor never used the word teaching, but that's what he was doing, teaching him how to see, how to connect lessons with life. One evening, the boy asked, "Why are you helping me?" "You don't have to." The janitor smiled, his eyes kind but tired. "Because once I had a son who needed help too. He was struggling, just like you. And I realized that sometimes all a child needs is someone to show them another way." The boy looked at him closely, realizing the janitor wasn't just a worker sweeping halls. He was a single father carrying his own burdens, yet still finding time to lift others. That thought touched him deeply. One day, after another math lesson disguised as a trip to the school canteen, the boy asked, "So what's the secret? Why does it feel different when you explain things?" The janitor chuckled softly. "The secret isn't in the books. It's in how you look at them. Don't ask, 'What if I fail?' Ask, 'What can I learn from this?' Failure doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're learning. Every mistake is a step forward, not backward." The boy repeated those words in his mind over and over. Every mistake is a step forward. That night, for the first time, he didn't dread opening his notebook. He still struggled, but instead of feeling crushed when he got something wrong, he remembered the janitor's words. Each wrong answer was no longer the end. It was just one more step forward. Gradually, things began to change. His test scores were still far from perfect, but they were improving. He felt proud when he solved even the simplest problem because he understood it, not because someone forced him to memorize it. His teachers noticed his small progress, though they didn't know the reason behind it. His classmates still teased him, but their words didn't cut as deep anymore. The boy had discovered something more powerful than grades, the belief that he could learn, just in his own way. Every day, he looked forward to those quiet evening talks with the janitor. They spoke not only about schoolwork, but also about life, about how hard work mattered more than privilege, about how kindness could change a person's day, about how true strength came from getting back up after falling. For the boy, these lessons became the real education he had been missing all along. And so, what began as a chance encounter with a poor janitor slowly grew into something extraordinary, a mentorship, a friendship, and perhaps the one thing that would change his life forever. The changes didn't come overnight, but they came steadily. The boy still struggled in class, but something inside him was different now. He no longer looked at his books with fear. Instead, he looked at them with a kind of quiet determination. He had stopped expecting himself to get everything right the first time. The janitor's words echoed in his mind every time he made a mistake. Every failure is just another step forward. At school, his teachers began to notice. His test scores were still far from perfect, but they weren't covered in red marks anymore. Sometimes he got half the answers right, sometimes even more. For a boy who used to fail almost every time, that was a big step. One afternoon, when the teacher handed back the results of a math test, the boy sat staring at the paper in disbelief. He had scored better than ever before. Not top marks, not even close, but enough to feel a surge of pride. For the first time, he felt like maybe he wasn't hopeless after all. Of course, his classmates still teased him. "Oh, so you passed this time? What, did your dad pay the teacher?" one boy sneered. But their words didn't sink as deep as before. The boy just folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his bag. He knew the truth, and that was enough. Every evening, he still met the janitor. Their lessons continued, not in classrooms or through textbooks, but in hallways, empty classrooms, and the little corners of the school most people ignored. They fixed broken chairs, replaced light bulbs, and even patched up a crack in the wall. With each task, the janitor slipped in lessons about science, patience, and problem solving. The boy found himself looking forward to those quiet hours more than anything else in his day. He felt safe there, free from judgment, free from the crushing weight of expectations. At home, things were different too. His father still demanded results, still pushed him, but slowly he began to notice something he hadn't seen in a long time: effort. One evening, as the boy sat at his desk with his books open, his father paused at the doorway. Usually, the boy would have been staring blankly at the pages, but this time he was scribbling notes, his face full of concentration. "Studying again?" his father asked, his voice softer than usual. The boy looked up and nodded. Yes. His father didn't say anything else. He simply gave a small nod and walked away. But inside, the boy felt a flicker of warmth. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it wasn't disappointment either. It was a step forward, just like the janitor always said. The real test came during the midterm exams. The boy sat at his desk in the exam hall, heart pounding. In the past, he would have frozen the moment he saw the first question. But this time, he remembered the janitor's advice. Don't think about failing. Think about what you can learn from each question. He took a deep breath, picked up his pen, and began to write. The paper wasn't easy. Some questions confused him, but instead of panicking, he skipped them and moved to the ones he understood. Bit by bit, he filled in the answers. When the time was up, he handed in the sheet with trembling hands, but not the same trembling of fear as before. This time it was hope. When the results were announced, the boy couldn't believe his eyes. He hadn't just scraped by. He had actually passed in every subject. For the first time in his life, he had cleared all his exams. The teachers were surprised. His classmates were shocked. And when he brought the report card home, his father stared at it in silence for a long moment. Finally, he said, "You're improving." It was just 2 words, but for the boy, they meant everything. That night, he lay in bed thinking about the journey. He thought about how hopeless he had felt just months ago, how close he had been to giving up. And then he thought about the janitor, the man who had given him his evenings, his patience, and most of all, his belief. The boy knew he still had a long way to go. He wasn't suddenly brilliant. He wasn't suddenly at the top of his class. But he was no longer failing at everything. He was learning, step by step, mistake by mistake, and that gave him more strength than he had ever felt before. One evening, as they finished fixing a broken desk together, the boy said quietly, "Thank you for everything." The janitor smiled. "You did the work. I just showed you another path." The boy shook his head. "No one else ever believed I could learn. Not my teachers, not even my father. But you did. That's what made the difference." The janitor's eyes softened. Sometimes, all we need is someone to believe in us. That's the real secret. The boy carried those words with him like a treasure. He didn't know where life would take him, but he knew he was no longer the same boy who had once sat crying over failed tests. He was changing, growing stronger, and it was all because someone had shown him that failure wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And little did he know, this was only the start of a much bigger journey, one that would shape the rest of his life. Years passed, and the boy who once failed every exam slowly became someone no one could have imagined. He didn't turn into the top student overnight. He didn't suddenly master every subject. But he grew into a young man who knew how to keep trying, who no longer feared failure, and who had learned the greatest lesson of all, that persistence and belief mattered more than perfection. By the time he left school, he had passed all his classes with respectable grades. They weren't perfect, but they were his, earned through effort, through countless evenings of quiet lessons hidden in everyday things. And though his father still wished he had been top of his class, even he admitted that his son had changed. He had grown confident, patient, and determined. The boy never forgot the man who had made it possible. Every time he looked at a math problem, he thought of the apples in the cart. Every time he read history, he remembered the photographs in the hallway. Every time he fixed something at home, he heard the janitor's voice explaining that even the smallest part could cause a big problem, and every problem could be solved if you stayed calm. The janitor had given him more than just tricks to study. He had given him a new way to see life. Years later, when the boy had grown into a young man ready to step into the world, he carried those lessons with him. He went on to build a career, not because of wealth alone, but because he knew how to work hard, how to learn from mistakes, and how to keep moving forward when others doubted him. One day, long after leaving school, he returned to visit. The building looked the same, though it felt smaller now. He walked through the halls, with memories flooding back, the fear, the loneliness, the shame, and then the hope that had slowly taken its place. He searched for the man who had changed it all. He found him in the same place, sweeping the hallway. His hair now streaked with more gray, his movements a little slower, but still steady. The young man approached and said softly, "Do you remember me?" The janitor looked up, studied his face, and then smiled. "Of course. How could I forget?" They sat together for a while, talking just like they used to. The young man told him about his journey, about how he had managed to find his footing in life. "I owe it to you," he said quietly. "You taught me the one secret I never found in books, that failure isn't the end, that every mistake is a step forward. Without you, I would have given up long ago." The janitor's eyes grew misty, though he quickly blinked it away. "You did the hard work," he replied. "All I did was remind you of what you already had inside you." The young man shook his head. "No, you believed in me when no one else did. That belief saved me." As they parted ways, the young man realized that success wasn't measured by grades, money, or titles. Success was about becoming stronger through struggles, kinder through pain, and wiser through mistakes. And all of that had begun in those quiet evenings when a poor janitor chose to share his time, his patience, and his heart with a boy who felt hopeless. In the years that followed, the young man carried that lesson everywhere. Whenever he met someone who was struggling, he remembered how it felt to sit alone with a failed test and a heavy heart. He remembered the simple kindness of a man who had no reason to help him, but did anyway. And he tried, in his own way, to pass that lesson forward. Because that was the real gift the janitor had given him, not just a way to learn, but a way to live. The story of the rich man's son wasn't about money, privilege, or shame. It was about the power of belief, the strength found in failure, and the quiet wisdom of a single father who swept the floors of a school, but left behind a legacy far greater than wealth. And so, the boy who once failed every test grew into a man who never stopped learning, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that learning was the secret to life itself.